Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Whether it's spring planting, fall harvesting, or just a drive across the state, soy biodiesel helps a diesel-powered engine operate in a demanding job. Soybean oil from Nebraska soybeans makes biodiesel a renewable fuel that's also environmentally responsible. The soybean checkoff plays a major role in supporting the use and availability of biodiesel. The Nebraska Soybean Board, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Frayne Olson looks at corn, soybean, and wheat markets. Greg Ibach explains why Japan is a critical market for Nebraska agriculture. Dick Perrin explains how lower gasoline prices are impacting ethanol. And Lauren Giesler describes white mold problems soybean growers dealt with in fields this year. North Dakota State Extension economist Frayne Olson is our grain market analyst this week. The first look at soybean harvest across the country shows growers are 7% complete and on pace compared with the nation's 5-year average. However, farmers are 5 points behind average in corn harvest, and only one of the top 18 producing states is ahead of its 5-year average in completion. That state is Pennsylvania. And in winter wheat, 19% of the crop has now been planted, 1 point back of normal. We talked with Frayne Thursday morning about market prices for the three commodities, but we started by asking for a quick update on conditions to the north.
We finished most of our small grain harvest, so that would be the barley, malt barley primarily. Spring wheat's pretty much finished up. We're still working on some tail end of the durum crop, but the durum was typically planted a little later, so the harvest is stretched out. There's a few people that have started on some soybeans, at least in the eastern part of the state, because we have a lot of specialty crops, in particular sugar beets. There's some of the farmers that have a lot of sugar beets also try and put in some early season or short season soybeans so they can get some of that harvested before the sugar beet season begins.
Let's look at each commodity here, Frayne. Let's start in corn. It's been back and forth this week. What's your outlook for that market? Yeah,
the corn market right now is really focused on trying to get those early harvest reports in. There's still a debate on how big is this crop, what kind of average yields are we going to get. We know that there's going to be pockets of some problems. We also know there's some areas of the country that are going to have some really fantastic yields. So once the corn harvest really starts to rolling, that's really what the market's looking for right now. As I look forward in my crystal ball, I think for the next couple of weeks, corn will primarily be in a trading range. There isn't a lot of activity on the export side. We're still kind of waiting for the harvest reports.
Do you think there's a shot to get back above 4 in the near term?
Short term, probably not. I think as we get rolling on the harvest, unless there's some real big surprises on the yield end, we're going to have some harvest pressure. We know that there's already been a lot of pre-selling of the corn crop. We're going to get the harvest deliveries going through the system. Depending upon the size of yields, we may have some, again, additional harvest pressure for guys that run out of harvest space or storage space, have to sell directly off the combine. I'm getting quite a few questions from farmers saying, well, if I have to sell off the combine, what do I do next? How do I try and maintain some ownership? So I think that, to me, that's a signal that there's a pretty good crop out there, and individually there'd be some farmers running short as bin space.
If you do have space, are you going to sit and wait?
That would be my recommendation. I think, again, we have the crop that's already been pre-harvested or pre-sold, excuse me. The pipeline will be refilled. We've got some carryover stocks from last year to deal with. I do think the normal harvest basis levels will start to widen out as the grain system trying to figure out where do we find a home for all its grain. I think there's going to be incentive to try and put it in storage. And there's a carry in the market on the future side. So there's a lot of signals telling us that put it in the bin and wait to see what happens as harvest concludes.
Soybeans, meanwhile, are as low as we've seen them in quite some time. Is there any hope in sight there?
Well, I do think there is some hope, but it's not necessarily short term. I think we're going to have to wait until we basically get the harvest over with and the market starts to shift their attention and focus onto the South American crop. Technically they can start planting soybeans now in the northern parts of Brazil. It's been a little bit slow because of some dry conditions there, but they have a very, very wide planting window, especially again in the northern regions. So the market right now is really focused on the U.S. crop, but I think once we get that into the bin, we start looking forward a little bit onto the South American crop. There's going to be a lot of focus on the weather and what the impacts of El Nino might be to, in particular, the southern growing regions and their planting progress, because there tends to be a lot of rainfall, in particular, in the early season.
So the positivity could come from weather down in South America, you think?
That's the most likely at this point. Again, unless there's some surprises when we get combines rolling here in the U.S., yield reports come in a lot lower than we expect. Of course, that would change the psychology of the market quite a bit. I guess I'm not anticipating that. I do think, again, the next real hope for any kind of rally or surprise in the marketplace will be some kind of planting problems coming from South America.
Let's move into wheat then, and winter wheat planting has started, but just tell me where prices are right now for wheat.
Well, hopefully we've seen the harvest lows, the market lows for wheat. And again, we are starting to hear some reports of winter wheat seedings and some guys planting into dry dirt. Again, right now at this stage of the game, not a big issue. The wheat market is also looking, though, to the winter wheat plantings going on in Russia and the Ukraine. And in particular in Russia now, that's starting to get a little more attention. They have some very dry conditions. They had enough rain during the growing season to get a decent yield, a decent crop for the 2015 production. But they, too, are starting to plant some of their winter wheat for the 2016 year. And there's a few more concerns and issues showing up in that arena as well. So the wheat market globally is also looking not only at the U.S., but also what's happening in Russia.
Quarterly grain stocks on Wednesday. Frayne, what are you looking for?
Well, I really don't anticipate any major surprises. I think the corn market's going to be the one that looks at those quarterly stocks report the closest. And the primary reason is we have a hard time tracking feed usage, feed utilization. So we look at the quarterly stocks, the year-end summaries, which will come out now in September, and we'll start making some adjustments, kind of back calculating to say, well, what is that feed usage really going to be? So the corn market's going to focus the most on that. I don't expect any major surprises, but of course, USDA sometimes throws us a curveball. So, again, we'll have to wait to see what the numbers really come out at.
Next week, Luke Beckman from Central Valley Ag will join us to look at corn and soybean markets after the USDA releases its quarterly grain stocks report. Iowa State Extension livestock economist Lee Schultz will also be with us to look at hog markets. We told you earlier this year, Japan is one of the most important countries to Nebraska agriculture. It's this state's top international buyer of beef and pork. As a whole, Japan imports 60% of its food, and the United States is its largest supplier of agricultural goods. Future trade between the two countries could be impacted by the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, a 12-nation trade agreement that continues to be worked out. Earlier this week, we talked with Nebraska Department of Ag Director Greg Ibach about his recent trip to Japan, which preceded a trade mission to Asia from Nebraska Governor Pete Ricketts.
Well, Japan, we went on a trade mission with the Lieutenant Governor. And it was to promote Nebraska agricultural products, and specifically red meat, pork and beef. And we worked with USMEF, and we had representatives from a number of Nebraska commodity groups present that actually contributed money to do some of the promotional events and work with stores and promote beef and pork in that marketplace. Why is it important to go over there and meet with these people face to face? What kind of benefit does that bring back for the state? Well, first of all, Japan's our most important market. 50% of the pork and 20% of the beef that goes out of Nebraska ends up in Japan. So, they're good customers. We need to go over there and say thank you and ask them to continue their business, because Australia's there and Europe is there trying to sell beef and pork respectively. And so we got to be there to say hello, we want your business. And then we also, anytime we're a foreign product going into their marketplace, so the promotional activities we do, the stories we tell, help make our foreign product familiar to them and increase their comfortability with purchasing from us.
Is that a market that could increase for the U.S. consumer, or for Nebraska products, I guess I should say, or is that a market that's stagnant?
Lots of people refer to Japan as being a mature market, and I think we learned that it's anything but a mature market. I think there is a lot of optimism on the business side of Japan, the importers, that with TPP looking like it will probably, we'll have some resolution yet this year, I hope, that the lowering of the tariffs on U.S. beef and pork make us super competitive with Australian beef and European pork, because they already have agreements in place. And so they're really thinking that because of our quality, we will be able to step in there and start taking away market share.
So from Japan, you flew to Hawaii for the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture, of which you are now the president. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
Quite a presence to be in here today.
Yeah, well, I don't know about that. It doesn't feel any different than being vice president.
You're just a normal guy, aren't you? Tell me about the purpose of those meetings.
So that's a national association, similar to like when Governor Heinemann was president of the National Governors Association. So we get together with the 50 other states and 3 provinces to discuss ag issues and try to work together to share experiences, like on avian influenza, for states that are worried about it. If it shows up in their state, what lessons did we learn that they can apply? We share that kind of information. And then we also work on policy issues. And so we pass resolutions to bring to Congress's attention of things that, we try to stay, since agriculture is highly variable across the 50 states, we try to stay out of those real controversial that might pit one state or region against another state or region. But, those overarching ones we think we can make a difference on. And then we also work very closely with FDA, USDA, and EPA. They all regulate agriculture in some way, shape, or form. And so as they're developing regulations or implementing statutes that Congress passed, we work with them to try to make sure that they're as workable as they can be for agriculture.
Not to be too specific, but with avian influenza, what's the general feeling you get from other states about the coming fall and winter?
USDA has worked really hard to prepare states and make sure states have plans and have thought about how they're going to react to it. So I think in general states are very prepared, and so we're probably, if anything, I hope we're over worried about it. But there's a fairly significant concern at USDA that the migration back to the south this fall will bring another wave of bird flu, especially in the mid-Atlantic states where they avoided it last time around, and there's large populations of birds. I think we're well positioned in Nebraska with a smaller poultry population to be able to manage the threat, but it all depends on how virulent the strain is at this point in time and whether or not it actually gets into our flocks again.
Through our previous reporting from Japan, you can learn more about Japan's imports of U.S. ag products. You can also find out more about how the Trans-Pacific Partnership could impact trade between the two countries. You can find those videos under the Japan playlist of our YouTube channel. The September Nebraska farmer says many growers would like to employ a no-till system, but there are some common hurdles to overcome. This month's issue says the best answers come from veteran no-tillers who've worked through difficulties and found methods to beat them. To learn about 4 common no-till challenges and advice on beating them, you can check out the September issue of Nebraska Farmer. The price for a regular gallon of gasoline fell nearly 5 cents this week to average $2.33 across the country. The cost is more than $1 cheaper than a year ago, and gasoline is now at its lowest level since mid-February. West Texas Intermediate oil futures, meanwhile, have bounced off their lows from mid-August, but the current levels, hanging around $46 a barrel, are half of what they were at this time last year. In an interview with UNL Ag Economics professor Dick Perrin last December, we discussed the coming oversupply in oil. We talked with Dick again this week to learn how oil prices are affecting gasoline and ethanol, and started by asking about how oil prices have moved recently.
They've been wandering around for about a year now. But recently we've seen they were down a year ago to $40 range, and then they were back up during the winter and some of the spring. They've been back down now. They up and down this past week. It's hard to keep track unless you pay close attention.
Why is there so much pressure on oil prices? We saw them dip below $40 for a time recently.
Well, basically, we just got a lot of production. As many of you are aware, the U.S. has increased its output by about 30% in the last 2 years. Canada has increased its output. Many people are expecting Iran to come back into the market, so we put all these together, and it's a big increase in the supply side. Yeah. And on the demand side, the whole world economy is sluggish, especially China, which is the second largest petroleum user.
What's the effect on gas prices?
In the past, prior to this last year, anytime that oil price has been down and below $50, gasoline prices at the pump have been down below $2. Now, they're not down below $2 in Nebraska, but they are in the southeast U.S. is down below $2. We're still, I think, $2.30 or something like that. West Coast is still $3. So there's a big geographical dispersion in oil prices. But in general, gasoline prices are going to keep coming down as long as the oil price stays below $50. And I'm certain that that's going to be the case. I'm pretty certain that that's going to be the case for probably the next year.
Lower oil prices, lower gasoline prices over the next year at least, or next year, would have what impact on ethanol?
Not a good impact on ethanol, unfortunately. I think with ethanol prices where they are right now, which is around $1.40 a gallon, is just about break even in terms of plants operating budgets. Some of them are a little more efficient and can continue, but I think it's going to be quite a bit of pressure, especially if the corn prices stay up, which we all hope the corn prices stay up for the farmers' sake. And if the ethanol prices continue to slide, I think it's going to be very difficult for a lot of ethanol plants in Nebraska.
What do you think it means for investment in the ethanol industry?
We're not having much investment in the ethanol industry right now in any case. So I don't think there'll be any disinvestment, but I certainly don't think there's going to be any investment in new plants or new capacity in ethanol in the near future.
It doesn't spur on more investment. It relies more on oil then.
That's right. So continued low oil prices are great for consumers, not very good at all for the ethanol industry, which in turn means not very good. If ethanol industry starts to shut back, as it did a few years back, they're going to consume less corn. That's going to bring the corn prices down. So it's not good for ethanol. It's not good for corn producers, and it's certainly not good for the environment, because with oil prices this low, the incentives for any kind of renewable fuels, including ethanol, it makes it very difficult economically for them to continue to develop and grow, and I think that's really bad for the environment.
Dick recently wrote an article for Cornhusker Economics on ethanol and gas prices. We'll link to that on the Market Journal website. The USDA's cold storage report shows red meat supplies in freezers on August 31st were up 3% from last month and up 26% from last year. More specifically, beef was up 2% from the previous month and 36% higher than a year ago. Continuing effects from avian influenza showed in the agency's chicken and eggs report, with total egg production and number of layers both down 9% from last year. Iowa's egg output was 45% lower than August 2014, but still barely enough to lead the nation. Nebraska Extension educator Jenkins says now is a great time for farmers and ranchers to evaluate the condition of their cows. Jay says body condition scoring is one of the most important factors in getting cows rebred, with thin cows taking longer to come into heat after calving. He says animals are scored on a 1 to 9 scale, where 1 is extremely thin and 9 is overly overweight.
We want our cows generally to be in a body condition score of 5 or better at calving. If we body condition score them now, we have plenty of time to make changes. If we find our cows are thinner now than we would like, say their body condition score 4, and we want them to increase the body condition score between now and calving, we have lots of options. We could wean early, and in some cases, just weaning a calf would drop a cow's nutrient requirements by 25%. If we wait later, we just sort of prolong that decision, and the longer we prolong it, the faster she has to gain in order to catch up, and the more expensive that gain gets.
Through one of Jay's recent articles, which you can find on the Market Journal homepage, you can learn more about body condition scoring and learn about apps from Nebraska Extension that can help you in assigning condition scores. Soybean harvest has begun in Nebraska. Growers have brought in 3% of the crop, 1 point behind the state's 5-year average. The USDA currently rates nearly a quarter of this year's soybeans as good to excellent. But at Husker Harvest Days last week, Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Lauren Giesler says there have been issues. We talked with Lauren at the event about how white mold became a problem for many growers this season.
Well, we are seeing quite a bit, and really nothing that the guys are going to do now, but really a lot of them are worried about how they're going to manage it next year. And particularly most of the time with white mold, you know, that's a disease that in the past we'd say maybe 1 in 10 years, but with the weather that we've had the last 3 years in a row, some of our producers to the northern part of the state have been hit with white mold. So I just want to encourage them to really, as they're starting to pick out seed varieties, make sure they're picking the best thing they can there. There's still not a lot of difference there, but there is a little bit that they can do. The other one is, you know, as they're putting in their plan for next year, any of our farmers that are using, you know, drills or narrow rows, that's going to be more favorable for white mold. So look at, you know, if you can in your operation, extend that out to a 30-inch row planting in those fields to get a lot of white mold. And then the other one is, you know, looking at, you know, how are they going to manage it going into the season. White mold's a disease that we've got to look at fungicide applications during flowering. And that's a time where you're going to have to look at that extended forecast, because that's when the disease starts. Even though they see it now, they got to make those applications well before they see anything. And so they got to be at a pretty high risk for white mold to want to make that investment.
So these fields will recur then with white mold?
They will, and the thing is too, like even if they're rotating to the other side of the quarter, or if it's something that's, you know, in there and they've had white mold in their operation, they probably have the potential to have it in a lot of these other areas. So particularly just, you know, if it's one half of a section or the other, they're going to have it there too. How
effective can variety selections be?
Variety selection is not going to be ideal for managing white mold, but it is something that can reduce it a little bit. There's not great resistance or tolerance in lines, but there are a few subtle differences. So just try to select that. This is the first thing. That's the easiest thing to do. And then look at that row spacing, and then also look at, you know, what are you going to do in your plan? If you've had it significantly, are you going to use fungicides in the future?
You mentioned that the applications are useful at flowering, but when do you decide if you have enough to make the application?
Well, the key is they're going to have to really look at their history. So most of our farmers know if they've had significant white mold problems. If you're a farmer that just had it this year and you just had a little bit of it, I wouldn't worry too much about it. But if you've got a history here in the last couple years that you've had a significant amount, that's when we're going to look at you know, going ahead and making that investment at flowering. Watch the weather forecast next year. When you're in that time, we'll be talking about this again then. But you know, I just think it's something that they really ought to be looking at a plan, you know, as they go forward, you know, down the road. This is something that can be pretty significant if we maintain these cool, wet conditions into 2016.
Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension state climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. Of course, during this last week, the big item of interest was the big storm system that moved through the central plains that brought some heavy precipitation to portions of Nebraska. So far, the heaviest totals have come from northeast and east central Nebraska, particularly just southwest of Sioux City, Iowa, and of course in the Omaha metropolitan area, where between 5 and 6 inches of precipitation were reported with this system. Now, as we get into north central Nebraska, general totals were anywhere from about 3/4 of an inch to about 1.5 inches, with isolated pockets of 2 to 3 inches. And as we move south of the Interstate 80 region, that's where the precipitation total started to drop off dramatically, particularly in central, south central, portions of southwest, and a substantial portion of the panhandle really didn't receive much more than a dusting of precipitation to upwards of 1/2 inch. So we still have some abnormally dry conditions to deal with, particularly in the western portions of the state. The panhandle looks to be the worst of the case with the dry conditions, but we have seen an expansive area of southwest and portions of south central Nebraska that really could stand to receive a good 1 to 2 inches of precipitation, particularly since we're having some problems in terms of wheat planting with the very hard soil conditions interfering with the ability to put out the wheat into the ground. So do we have moisture in the forecast? Let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we can expect. The first thing we'll draw your attention to is that we have ridging across the central United States. So for today here in Nebraska, it looks like it'd be a very nice day. Very much in the way of seasonal temperatures, upper 70s east to low 80s west. And the only activity that we see in terms of potential precipitation is in the far Pacific Northwest, and that is not expected to have any impact in Nebraska for the next couple of days. So as we go into tomorrow, we will see that the energy starts to move into the Pacific Northwest and will rapidly slide across the northern plains. But for here in Nebraska, the ridge actually expands northward and eastward. So we should see a temperature boost of 4 to 5 degrees here in Nebraska compared to today. And that will mean tomorrow's highs will be in the lower 80s to the upper 80s, depending on location of the state, coolest to the east. As we get into Monday, we will start to see some flattening of this ridge, but it still keeps the warm air in place over the Central Plains. So we'll be looking at probably our warmest day of the week statewide, low 90s in the southwest, to the mid-80s across eastern Nebraska. But most of the precipitation, if it does fall, will occur in the Dakotas. And as we get into Tuesday, now we start to see some cool air starting to move into the Great Lakes with that system moving across the northern plains, and that will allow a little bit of cool air to filter in to northeast Nebraska, but we're keeping the precipitation at bay at this time. In the southwest corner of the state, we're still going to remain in that warm sector, so it's very possible to see upper 80s to low 90s once again. But by the time we get to Wednesday, the system starts in the Pacific Northwest, starts making its way toward the Central Plains. That's going to increase the interaction with the monsoon flow coming out of the southwest, and we start to expect to see thunderstorms developing in the late afternoon hours in the western part of the state, and that will carry over in the evening hours into central Nebraska, and a more widespread precipitation outbreak on Thursday as the system moves across the state, showers and scattered thunderstorms statewide, and that will continue into Friday across eastern Nebraska, more likely going to be more showers than anything else with a cooling trend. So if we look at the temperature forecast, we are looking at the warmest conditions this week, cooling down during the midweek period with those chances of precipitation, and then as we look at the 8 to 14 day forecast from next Thursday to the following Tuesday, the entire lower 48 is looking to be above normal in terms of temperatures, and as far as precipitation, yet another system makes its impact on Nebraska with a bullseye right over the Central Plains.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on grain markets, U.S. ag trade with Japan, ethanol prices, and white mold in soybeans. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Congratulations to our Apple Watch winners from Husker Harvest Days, Rachel Court from Air, who won via our drawing, and Alan Vandenberg from Brainerd, who won through our photo contest. Next week, Luke Beckman will analyze corn and soybean markets, and Lee Schultz will look at the USDA's quarterly hogs and pigs report. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.